Hello everyone. It's 11th week, and last week we examined the welfare effect of trade policies, and we found that from our discussion on welfare effect of trade policy, we found that in majority cases, always, whatever trade interventions actually ended up with deterioration of social welfare, only with some exception for a large economy to impose an import tariff. In that case, they could expect some possible welfare gains when terms of trade gains dominate deadweight loss, but that was a sort of exceptional case. So in most cases, we have found that, for example, for small economy, whatever types of trade interventions always reduces trade policy interventions. Always reduces. Social welfare, only causing deadweight loss. For large economy, we also found that especially export subsidy deteriorate social welfare a lot, much more serious way than the small economies policy interventions. And also, we have found that for a small economy, import tariff, in most cases, also reduces social welfare. And the only exceptional case where tariff might improve social welfare would be the very exceptional improve social welfare only when so-called terms of trade gains dominate. It's larger than the loss caused by deadweight loss. Otherwise, we have found in most cases, whatever types of trade policy always deteriorated, reduces social welfare. Then question is why? Why on earth kind of advanced economy, large economy, small economy, developing economies always keep on and repeat this stupid trade policy, which actually reduces their social welfare? What's going on there? And so this question is can be answered only when we take so-called political economy of trade policies. And this discussion started with this question: why on earth most countries, including large economies, small economies, countries keep on kind of welfare reducing trade policies? Are they crazy or just stupid? or just ignorant. And it was a mystery why United States keep on self-damaging trade policies and why European Union keep on serious self-welfare deteriorating export subsidy for their agricultural products. And eventually, this question on those mysterious repetition of those welfare-reducing, self-contradictory, seemingly quite stupid policies are repeated. And so this political economic approach implies introduce some more realistic objective function. Traditionally, we have assumed that policymakers, in most cases, who makes the final decision on trade policies. Eventually, top politicians takes the full responsibility of whatever trade policies. In the United States, who decide trade policy? Only Donald Trump, he himself, by his own personal whims and caprice, he decide his import tariff, although it is changing every day. Whenever he wakes up, he comes to have some different mind. And so in most cases, the top politicians take full responsibilities of trade policies. So trade policy makes decide their trade policy, let's say T represent the trade policy, to maximize. Traditionally, we have believed that all politicians like Donald Trump or earlier US president or even here in South Korea, current president, earlier president, including Park Geun-hye, always they have claimed that they are just concerned about improving social welfare, improving the whole economies, whole welfare of their countries. So according to their argument, even according to Donald Trump's argument, he is arguing he raised his tariff using stupid reciprocal tariff. Say he argues that just to make the United States great again, to maximize U.S. welfare. So they decide their trade policies to maximize, according to their argument, to maximize so-called social welfare of each country. Donald Trump argues that he increases trade tariffs. He introduced reciprocal tariffs just to make United States great again, to maximize social welfare. And now there is no such a naive or stupid guy to believe that kind of nonsense argument. Everybody knows that. But say naive economists have believed that most policymakers are actually trying to maximize social welfare, but we found that majority of import tariff trade policy actually does not really maximize social welfare. So it was some mystery, and we came to have this question. But instead of kind of believing naively this unrealistic, seemingly unreliable kind of assumption, when you have introduced more realistic objective function, they are trying to maximize their own political objective. Their own personal political objective. What is their political objective? To maximize their political power or influence. What enables to maximize their political power or influence? In a democratic representative system, actually, they can get their political power by getting maximum votes in the coming elections. So when he introduced this much more realistic objective function of trade policymakers, they determined their trade policy to maximize their own personal political objective function, their own political interest. How can they make their political influence or power, say, in maximum scale? By getting maximum support in coming elections. So, why Donald Trump have introduced reciprocal tariff? Because that guy believes by introducing reciprocal tariff, probably he might get more political support from those kind of far right-wing MAGA peoples, far right-wing kind of voters. And this replacement of more realistic objective function than the earlier non-realistic social welfare maximizing kind of policy objective function, we could easily figure out all the earlier case of mystery. Why United States have repeated their self-damaging export subsidy policies repeatedly, actually deteriorating their social welfare. Because they have found, even if export subsidy deteriorated their social welfare, still export subsidy was very useful to maximize, increase their political support from their far right-wing supporter, or they could get more political donation from exporting firms, and also by imposing import tariff, even by small economy, which always reduces their social welfare, still they could get lots of political support from import competing industries from these economies. So we can well figure out that, say, when you introduce this political objective functions, focusing on actual motivation of the trade policymakers, we could understand why this seemingly quite a mysterious, self-damaging policies have been repeatedly adopted. So, more in a more specific and concrete way, we are talking about political economy or trade policies. Or trade policies, and here they are trying to determine trade policy to maximize their political objective function, which is actually to get maximum supporting vote in the coming elections. This is the so-called path to maximize their political power in democratic representative systems. Even in dictator countries like kind of autocracy like Russia or in China, still they have their election system, although it's just a fake election system. Anyhow, say whether in real democratic regime or fake democratic regime, in whatever cases, still they keep election system. So by getting maximum supporting votes, they can get maximize their political power. And how can they maximize their supporting votes? The first way to maximize supporting vote would be to choose a policy that is supported by median voters. That's what we call median voter theory. Median voter theorem. So we can say, describe the distribution of voters can describe, for example, these days in this way. Let's say these are, for example, all the different range of trade policies supported by voters. And let's say this is the tariff to be zero, there's free trade. And this would be the case of maximum level of tariff, which is so-called prohibitive tariff. Prohibitive tariff. What is prohibitive tariff? Tariff which is so high that eventually prevent international trade. And that would be if the international price is given this way and import tariff is imposed this way. And this would be what the domestic price after tariff was imposed. And this what domestic tariff after tariff was imposed is higher than earlier domestic price, then can you think about any possibility that when the imported goods price is higher than their own domestic price, can you think about any consumer that will purchase, when you assume both products have same homogeneous qualities, and given the same quality, is there any consumer who will purchase more expensive imported good? No one. So we can say, which is prohibitive tariff? Tariff which is the same or higher than when you move this term to what? Domestic price minus international price. So if tariff is higher, same or higher than the difference between domestic goods price and international price, that's what we call the tariff which makes the imported goods price to be higher than earlier domestic goods price. Therefore, there will be no consumption for any imported goods, which eventually prohibit whatever trade. That's what we call prohibitive tariff. So let's think about all different range of trade policy, and if and this is the number of the voters, number of voters, and let's say in the United States these days, after Donald Trump's repeated argument that free trade have devastated U.S. economy, and so some real extreme guys think that simple closing whatever their own market, going back to autarky might be better for them. And still there are some number of voters who supporting totally closed economy, or also there are a small number of voters who prefer free trade, or if tariff is negative means provide import subsidy. So let's say the median voter is somewhere located somewhere here. Let's say this is a so-called median voters. And why does this median voters supporting preference for the politician really matter? If first let's think about the case that currently Democratic parties, let's say Donald Trump is actually Republican Party supports very protective trade policies, while Democratic Party relatively prefer to, so this is Democratic Party's kind of trade policy agenda, then we can easily say that at least voters who prefer support more protective policies will definitely support Democratic Party, Republican Party, while for voters who prefer a free trade policy will definitely support, who are located here will definitely support Democratic Party. What will be the voters' kind of support located, their preference are located in between? Probably half of these guys might also support Democratic Party, and the other guy, remaining half, would be support Republican Party. Yeah, on the right-hand side of median voters. And then what will be the best response of Democratic Party if it really wants to get more political support in coming elections? Possibly by changing their policy agenda from here to move to here. Then if they change their policy commitment here, then they can get this further definite supporter for Democratic Party, and they might also take roughly half of this remaining guys to support Democratic Party. Then what will be the response of this Republican Party? If Republican Party is rational enough, they will also to take back the supporters of who have changed their mind to support Democratic Party by changing their policy agenda somewhere near to here, to extreme. And then the kind of, so this would be initial policy agenda, and this would be second policy agenda of Democratic Party. If Republican Party moves their agenda to here, then also we can easily expect that if Republican Party move to here, then Democratic Party will also try to take back, to change to here, and eventually they will converge to the policy supported by this medium policy supported by medium voter, eventually to get the maximum political support. So medium voters theorem would be trade policymakers. Trade policy makers can maximize kind of supporting votes, political supports by choosing trade policies supported by median voters. And this choice will eventually lead all parties, all candidates in repeated election. Eventually, by the end of when they close to the final date of the elections, eventually both party, Republican Party, Democratic Party, ends up with their policy ends up with the policy supported by median voter here. And they converge eventually to here. And so that's the reason why when you get really close to the final date of the election, every candidate's trade policy sounds like quite similar. not only in the United States, also in South Korea, in most countries. That's the feature that can be explained by median voters. So in that case, what we can expect would be at least only this median voter theorem works. There is nothing really to worry about too much about possible real crazy protective policies. And can we really say current trade policy actually adopted by Donald Trump is something really supported by median voter of US voters? Not really. The current trade policy adopted by Donald Trump is not actual policy supported by median voter in the US society, but mainly the voter agenda supported by far right-wing voters like the MAGA group, Make America Great Again groups, far right-wing groups. Then that kind of feature is also explained by another argument theorem. So we are talking about political economy of trade policies, and policymakers try to maximize. They choose their trade policy to maximize their political influence by choosing an agenda that is maximize their supporting votes. And first approach would be by choosing a policy agenda which is supported by median voters. That's what we call median voter theorem. But when you look at the details, more influential kind of factors that actually dominate the choice of politician is so-called collective action. We might call it also theorem. So if only median voter theorem dominates, then in most cases, trade policy supported by median voter might not be that much extreme trade policy like the current protective trade policy adopted by Donald Trump. Then how can he explain why Donald Trump, the guy who seems to be definitely addicted to maximize his political power for his own personal welfare, he should choose some moderate policies, which is really supported by median voter, but that's not the reality. He's actually choosing far extreme protective trade policy, mainly supported by MAGA group, far right-wing groups. The reason is, although a free trade policy might benefit maximum number of the consumers by reducing imported goods price, the majority of the consumer will be happy with the lower price level, with lower imported goods. But why have Donald Trump chosen such a sharp increase of the import tariff, such as a reciprocal tariff or even other types of product tariff reaching 50% for steel products, aluminum? What's going on there? Because politicians, policymakers are more heavily affected, more heavily and politically affected by interest groups. that can exercise more organized and influential political pressure. This is a self-evident story. So which types of interest group can exercise more organized and influential and consistent political pressure? Political pressure includes what so-called monetary kind of what donation and pressure, and also include politically organized pressure. And who will make this kind of consistent, organized, influential pressure, including the heavy monetary contribution or monetary pressure, and also other types of politically organized pressures. These types of politically influential, consistent, serious pressure can be only made by the group. This group would be so-called the interest group, where individual stake interest is high and big enough. So who is the kind of interest group where individual stake or interest or possible loss is big and serious enough? Can you expect the gains from free trade policy, which eventually reduces what imported goods price is such a heavy, influential life or death issue for majority of the consumers? Well, they might expect some benefit from lower price, but that reduced imported goods price is not that life or death issues. But what about the interest or stake of the import competing firms kind of stake or interest with the trade policies? When government introduced free trade policy reducing import tariff, the fortune of the import competing industry like the U.S. steel industry, U.S. aluminum industry, they might lose their job. That is life or death issues. So which group would be usually the group that will be well motivated to make their every possible efforts to exercise organized, consistent political pressure with respect to trade policies? The guy who individually get a life or death kind of impact, mainly import competing industry. So this interest group would be mainly import competing sector will face life or death kind of impact from free trade policies. So these guys are ready to make whatever kind of efforts to exercise their political pressure to policymakers eventually for them. What is the supported policy by these import competing sectors? To increase import tariff. Therefore, we can see that collective action theorem says which group can really exercise very organized, collective, and effective action to influence trade policymakers? Only import competing sector. Import competing sectors organize very effective and strong so-called this collective action. Collective action, which is political pressure to adopt protective trade policies. So the influence the trade policymakers get in their process of trade policy decision making would be, first we thought about median voter theorems, So theoretically, they might maximize their political support by choosing trade policy supported by median voter. But in reality, those median voters is not that much serious in promoting and supporting their policy, since their personal interest and stake is not that big, and that kind of policy is not a life or death issue for them. So they will be happy, but even if some other trade policy is adopted, they will not they are not ready to spend their money, time to organize, exercise political pressure. But for these guys, import competing sectors, for them to exercise their political pressure to protect their own job, their own industry, is life or death issues. So that's the usual case, since these import competing sector organize very influential interest group, and they make a real big difference in the election result. In most cases, eventually politicians ends up with this. Eventually, at least in most cases, or you can say in every case, in most cases, policymakers, politicians, policymakers, trade policymakers, end up with choosing protective trade policies. Why? To maximize their probability to be re-elected in coming election. Protective trade policies. This is what really happened in the period just before the Second World War, where every country initiated by the United States to choose protective policies. Why? To get their domestic political support in their own country. Germany, UK, all leading countries eventually chose protective trade policy, which eventually led to Second World War. What happened just before the First World War? same story. And what is happening these days, currently, same story. Initiated by United States and China, they have started trade war. And currently, mainly kind of considering the more fierce retaliation by the United States, other country might seem to restrain their own choice of what another retaliation by choosing protective trade policies. But if we do not really introduce multilateral efforts to going back to old good days of Bretton Woods system, another round of global trade war is highly likely these days. Why? Since that's to choose protective policy is the best way for an individual politicians to maximize their political objective, to maximize their political support in their own country at the individual country level. So these will end up with, if each trade policy makers incentives are just kind of what incentive works at the individual country level, we might see trade war, what we experience even currently and just before, as we experienced before the Second World War and First World War, is and it seems to be something inevitable. When you look at this political economic mechanism at the level of individual countries. So that's what really happened before Second World War, before First World War, and currently led by the Donald Trump's global trade war. And we can also, so we can say political economic structure of trade policy decision making, especially when you focus on so-called collective action theorem. It seems like trade war seems to be unavoidable when each country tries to maximize their political support. And so that kind of trade war, something as an inevitable outcome, can be also described using a simple payoff matrix of trade policies. And let's say this is, for example, the case of the United States, for example, and this is, let's say, for the case of South Korea. And they have two options, free trade policies or to choose protective trade policies. Same option for South Korea, free and protective trade policies. And let's say when both countries choose free trade policies, let's say they will gain, both of them will gain, so-called 10 billion US dollars welfare. And when they both choose protective policies, both countries will suffer a lot, for example, by the damage of the minus $5 billion. And while United States keeps the promise of free trade policies and South Korea cheat United States, then let's say this cheating behavior will give a much higher benefit, while the cheated guy will suffer more by being betrayed. And same story, if South Korea keeps the promise and US cheat, it will get more. So if the trade welfare payoffs is given in this way, when each country tried to choose so-called rational welfare maximizing trade policies, so-called Nash equilibrium trade policies, we can see that what is the Nash equilibrium strategies? Nash equilibrium strategy. What do we mean by Nash equilibrium? Nash is the guy who got Nobel Prize in economics, and this guy has shown equilibrium means what? The case where everybody finds this the kind of the case where they have no incentive to deviate from the given situations, just like the equilibrium in physics. So Nash equilibrium is basically a sort of a non-cooperative equilibrium. Non-cooperative equilibrium is the kind of equilibrium which just try to maximize my own welfare, disregarding the other guy's welfare. And that's the usual case when the policy decision is made in international case. Since every country politicians try to just maximize their own country, Korean president makes their decision in trade negotiation with Japan, mainly to maximize South Korea, not really caring about, say, Japanese welfare. So given Japanese welfare and given Japanese decision, South Korea tried to maximize, say, her own welfare. That's what we call a non-cooperative equilibrium or Nash equilibrium. So when both South Korea and United States take that kind of approach to maximize its own welfare, we can say South Korea will choose first, given U.S. possible choice of free trade, South Korea will choose its own best response, best policy when United States choose free trade, free or protective. Definitely for protective trade policy, 20 is larger than 10, though South Korea will choose protective policy. In case U.S. choose free trade policies, then what will happen if U.S. choose protective trade policy? In that case, -5 is definitely better than -10. It will choose protective policies. From the perspective of the United States, given Korean policy to choose free trade policy, it will choose free or protective. Definitely, free protective trade policy provide a higher payoff. What will be the case if Korea choose protective trade policy? Definitely, protective trade policy provides a better option than and they choose free trade policy. So what will be so-called Nash equilibrium here? We can see that each country has, in this case, a sort of dominant strategy. Dominant strategy means the best strategy which is not affected by the choice of other guys. Whether U.S. choose free trade policy or protective trade policy, always from the perspective of South Korea, to choose protective policy provides higher welfare than the other option. So this is a dominant strategy. Same story to the United States. So this is what so-called unique Nash equilibrium. But here we can see if they choose free trade policies, definitely both guys can improve their social welfare. Then this Nash equilibrium of so-called both countries choose protective trade policy, so-called trade war case. Then how can they get out of this worst outcome of trade war, which is a Nash equilibrium, to much better welfare where both guys can benefit much higher payoff benefit welfare from both choosing free trade policies. So this would be the very case, actually, when we consider political economic structure of trade policy decision-making process where collective action theorem dominates, then from the perspective of each country will just choose protective policy as a dominant strategy as predicted by collective action theorem. But we know that it actually provides worst outcome in comparison to the free trade policies. How can they get out of this trade war to move free trade policy? So, how to move to much better free trade regimes? And this is the basic motivation when we say so-called Bretton Woods system was designed. This is the very question raised by Roosevelt at the Bretton Woods meeting by the leader of the Allied country just before they end the Second World War. So unless they design an international mechanism, international institution that can prevent these types of recurrent kind of choice or protective policy, which is something unavoidable from the perspective of policymakers as a politician, to maximize their political support at each individual country, then another round of trade war is something unavoidable from the perspective of the Roosevelt or the leaders of Allied countries just before the Second World War. So they introduced so-called, as we discussed earlier, international trade organization, which have been rejected by U.S. Republican Party, and so as a substitute, intergovernmental body, General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, was introduced, and it has been eventually changed to WTO in 1995 as an international organization. And they expected these international organization to play the role as a mechanism that can induce each individual country to choose a protective policy, eventually change their policy to free trade policy. How? So the role of currently WTO, and in earlier case, International Trade Organization, which eventually changed to the Intergovernmental Agreement as a General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, was actually to change this kind of ugly structure which induces trade war by making so-called free trade policy as a dominant strategy. How? If South Korea choose and betrayed to choose protective policy, impose a big enough punishment. For example, if South Korea choose to deviate, cheat to choose protective policies, actually this WTO earlier case, ITO or GATT, can impose punishment by this much. Then after this punishment, eventually South Korea will get only payoff after being punished. This would be what so-called punishment against the protective trade policies. It will get payoff by $9 billion, which is actually lower than the payoff from choosing the same story. And even in this case, whenever South Korea choose protective policy, same punishment will be imposed, and then it'll end up with what? Much lower payoff than choosing protective policy. And same punishment will be imposed on the U.S. case, and U.S. Choose to betray, to choose protective trade policy. Again, this amount of punishment will be imposed them. Same story here. So eventually, U.S. will also get much lower payoff from choosing to betray their agreement for free trade policy. So if this kind of punishment imposed, new equilibrium would be if this punishment mechanism really credibly works from Korean side, even if they choose same non-cooperative nation approach, given U.S. policy to choose free trade policy, two options for South Korea, free trade or protective. You can see free trade is actually better. And what about in case U.S. choose protective trade policy? Still choosing protective free trade policy provides higher payoff. What about from the perspective of United States? In case South Korea choose free trade policy, two options, free or protective. Free trade policy provide better option. In case South Korea choose protective trade policy, free or protective, this is better. So by imposing these types of harsh enough punishment, which makes payoff from free trade policy is higher than the betraying non-cooperative trade policy, here we can say this much better outcome, free trade policy, can be a Nash equilibrium policy, even if when everybody chooses just to maximize their own welfare from the non-cooperative perspective. So the basic design of the ITO or currently WTO is the role of WTO to keep free trade policy, free trade regime is what? By making free trade policy as so-called dominant strategies. Dominant strategy. How can they make free trade policy as a dominant strategy? Again, more importantly, they can make free trade policy as a dominant strategy by imposing so-called this amount of credible punishment, so-called imposing harsh and big enough credible punishment against deviation strategy to both countries. So we can summarize the role of the current WTO initially it has started with International Trade Organization, again changing their name to General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. So we are talking about political economy of trade policies. In this context, we can say now we are moving to so-called multilateral free trade regime. Currently, WTO, which Donald Trump has successfully destructed, Donald Trump is doing his best to disrupt current WTO system. And why WTO earlier ITO, which has changed it to GATT in 1947, because U.S. Republican Party rejected this idea, and eventually in 1995, this intergovernmental agreement has changed their status to international organization. What is the role? Why they have thought this international multilateral free trade regime is something really required, since we have found that at the individual country level, politicians have a strong incentive to choose protective trade policy to make his political support in maximum scale to be re-elected. And that's what really happened just before the Second World War, First World War, even currently. And the role of this WTO as a multilateral free trade regime is kind of what objective is how to kind of keep free trade, or we can say how to prevent trade war. How to prevent trade war. This is the same question, how to keep free trade regime. Actually, same question. Is first the approach is by imposing so-called credible punishment. Punishment that makes free trade policies as a dominant strategy. Free trade policies as dominant strategies. So as we have seen here, if portion of punishment by this amount is really imposed to every deviation to protective trade policy, eventually welfare payoff from free trade policy turns out to be higher than this payoff after this punishment to both countries. So this punishment has made free trade policy as a dominant strategy, which is not really affected by the other countries' trade policies. And so this is the so-called idea for trade dispute settlement system. Trade dispute settlement system. Of the GATT system and WTO. And what has been tried by Donald Trump is to destruct this trade dispute settlement system. Currently, trade dispute settlement system of WTO is if one country, if United States, for example, violate their agreement to keep the free trade policy by choosing kind of bad deviation to choose protective trade policies. The current actual mechanism to impose these types of punishment was not really taking any direct punishment mechanism which can be implemented in the domestic sovereign state, but actual means of this punishment which has taken in current kind of trade dispute settlement system was actual punishment mechanism. Punishment mechanism was this dispute settlement system is also, say, implemented at WTO level, so-called dispute settlement mechanism. Dispute settlement mechanism, and this dispute settlement mechanism actually works by organizing so-called dispute settlement kind of panel, usually from 3 panelists, or at the maximum level 6 panelists, at least minimum 3 panelists, convened to assess who really made wrongdoing by choosing these types of protective trade policies. And if they decide United States really made the wrongdoing by choosing protective trade policy, while South Korea has kept abide by the WTO rule, then say this dispute settlement body, dispute settlement mechanism, or you can say dispute settlement kind of panel is organized, at least starting with 3 panelists at maximum, makes a kind of decision like the international legal system, who really have made wrongdoing by choosing protective trade policy. And this dispute settlement panel actually allow as a punishment, so the maximum level of punishment is so-called, they allow legal, possibly legal, so-called retaliation to the country who got damaged by the wrongdoing of the other country. So in case, even if South Korea has kept promised its original promise of keeping a free trade policy, and only United States have chosen a wrongdoing, betraying to choose protective trade policies, then as a result, South Korea has suffered this amount of loss. And the actual punishment imposed to the United States, currently adopted by WTO, is just allow South Korea, who are damaged by United States wrongdoing, so they allow South Korea to take what equivalent retaliation measures against United States. And actual kind of example and case happened 3 or 4 times for U.S. has adopted what even currently, although Donald Trump totally disregard and have destructed the system by kind of rejecting to appoint panelists. So currently in WTO systems, there is no minimum panelists are organized since United States, Donald Trump has rejected to appoint kind of panelists, minimum required panelists. So currently only 2 panelists remained, and that 2 panelists cannot really form effective dispute settlement panel. So current this dispute settlement mechanism itself has collapsed due to Donald Trump's kind of denial, rejection to appoint minimum required panelist. Although even in during the period U.S. has abided by this WTO rule, and when dispute settlement panel works, the maximum actual punishment is just to allow retaliation to the affected country. Then when you remember the actual example, U.S. was sentenced to have committed a wrongdoing by choosing a wrong protective trade policy in earlier anti-dumping cases, which has been raised by the South Korean government. And South Korean government won at the final dispute settlement panelist decision. So WTO has allowed South Korea to take retaliation to United States. What was the final result? So South Korea has demanded United States that since WTO has sentenced that you made a wrongdoing, why don't you correct your wrong behavior, repealing all your earlier wrongdoing of anti-dumping measures? And U.S. response was no answer, no response, just keeping the earlier kind of wrong protective trade policies. And South Korea has repeatedly kind of raised the question, why don't you comply to WTO's decision to repeal your earlier wrong decision? And current actual retaliation is WTO allowed South Korea to retaliate against the United States. Can South Korea take real, serious, and effective retaliation against the United States while United States kind of has a real control over South Korean government, mainly with the issues of protecting South Korea from North Korean atomic bomb threat and other security threat. South Korea is prohibited from developing its own nuclear arms by the international, anti-nuclear treaty. As you can easily expect, there was no real action taken by South Korea for a real meaningful retaliation against the United States. And that's not just the case of South Korea and the United States. In most cases, between the trade dispute between large and small economies, retaliation that might be taken by small economy against large economy means almost nothing. No real large economy will get serious enough and big enough punishment that really makes what payoff after punishment to be lower than the original payoff from deviation. So since this actual punishment itself is not real in terms of current system, so we can say since the current system of WTO's so-called punishment, what is it? It is just a legal allowance of the legal punishment, legally allowed punishment. Since the current system of punishment does not really work as credible punishment. Especially between large and small economies. We can say this punishment system itself, which makes free trade policy as a dominant strategy, the actual role of WTO's role to keep the free trade policy, to prevent protective policy was considered as quite limited. Then can you say WTO is just a kind of paper tiger, kind of making no real effective and providing any real credible enforcement power to push their choice to free trade policy by these types of credible punishment. And we know that this punishment taking the form of just retaliation does not really work as a credible enforcement mechanism for small economy. But however, still, till Donald Trump really destruct this trade dispute settlement system by rejecting to appoint minimum required panelist, WTO has worked surprisingly effective mechanism to keep free trade policy till Donald Trump show up. So how WTO could prevent trade war till Donald Trump destruct this trade dispute settlement systems? This mystery can be answered by making trade negotiation game, trade negotiation and trade policy as so-called repeated game. Repeated trade policy game. And this amazing mystery and secret power of repeated game can override serious damage of current WTO system, even if WTO cannot really impose harsh enough punishment that makes the payoff from deviation to be lower than the payoff from cooperative trade policy. As long as WTO can provide so-called international trade negotiation forum as a repeated game, still they could find the path to make each country to choose a free trade policy as what as Nash equilibrium policies. So we can see, we will continue our discussion in next week, but before we finish, I'll give you a very short idea what the mystery of to keep, how to prevent trade war. Same story, how to keep free trade regime. In repeated trade policy game. Securities, so-called, by choosing so-called trigger strategies. Or we might get the same story, or so-called tit-for-tat strategy. We can see that the payoff from free trade policy policies is higher than from protective trade policies. What is tit-for-tat strategies? If you hit my face sounding tit, I will hit your face sounding tat. Although it sounds somewhat differently, the level of pain would be exactly the same. So I will do just what you are doing to me. If you are keeping free trade policy, I will keep free trade policy too. If you betray me by choosing protective policy, I will retaliate you by choosing protective trade policy. Or by taking some more what so-called dismal policy. Trigger means what? If I trigger my gun, the bullet will kind of simply heading toward you. Can I take that bullet back after I triggered my gun? It's almost impossible. So once you betray me by choosing trade policy, I will trigger my gun, and that bullet cannot be taken back. It will simply go to you and kill you, implying if I kind of take a protective trade policy, I will retaliate you by choosing protective policy forever till Jesus Christ come back. If these two types of strategy is taken in repeated game, as long as the trade policy game takes the so-called repeated game, always we will find we'll find to choose free trade policy is best policies. And think about with the example. We will come back to this issue once again. If you choose free trade policy, I will choose free trade policy too. So if the game is repeated only for 3 times, since both guys keep the free trade policy over 3 period of repeated negotiation, each guy will get 10, 10, 10, 30 payoff. And then at the initial stage, while I keep the free trade policy, you deviate, and then at the first stage, you will get 20. But in next period game, I will retaliate, and then by choosing protective policies, then even if you take 20 in the first period, and in second and third period, you will get -5. Altogether, you will end up with a 10, much lower than 30 when both of you choose free trade policy. So you can easily see that in repeated game, as long as tit-for-tat strategies or trigger strategy is taken, then always choosing free trade policy is a better strategy. That's how it worked in the WTO system before Donald Trump. WTO actually worked as a very effective system to prevent trade war. Since WTO has convened trade negotiation in every year, and at least every 2 years it has convened WTO trade ministerial meetings, and it worked as a very credible, effective system to keep the free trade policy. As long as so-called this trade dispute settlement system works and make kind of to build the reputation, who is the bad country and who is good country. Okay, let's say that's it for this week's discussion, and next week we will continue our discussion more in detail about how WTO system has worked and how it has been destructed by Donald Trump, and how we can rebuild, and whether it is really possible to rebuild all those good days by rebuilding multilateral free trade system. All right, and see you next week.